Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Money laundering, a term thrown around and one that has taken down many powerful individuals throughout history. Drug cartels, offshore companies, big banks may become associated to money laundering. And according to the UN, the global economy loses anywhere between 800 billion to 2 trillion US dollars annually. But what is money laundering? How is it done? And how exactly does it damage the economy? In tonight's show, we'll look at this important issue and see how money laundering can be controlled. Joining us for this discussion is Einar Tangen, who's an economist, joining us from Beijing, and Saad Hassan, who's a journalist. Thank you both for joining us. Einar, I'd like to start off with you. Let's begin with the basics. Why is money laundered?
Can be a way of moving money overseas, which is not supposed to be. It might be your money legitimately, but you might be prevented from moving it to other places. And once it's there, there's often an attempt to obfuscate where that money, who controls it, and where it's being held and invested.
Okay. So, Saad, let me ask you this. We're seeing a rise in child trafficking and human trafficking and, of course, the usage of drugs. So does that correspond with the rise of money laundering too?
Yeah, of course it does. But we need to see that the major chunk of this money laundering, it has to do with the offshore accounts. It has to do with the illicit money that is moving around. We often hear about involvement of drug lords, drug money, child trafficking. But to be really honest, the major chunk comes from the under-invoicing or over-invoicing of your international trade. The major chunk comes from multinational companies, how they avoid taxation, how they move money, how they use different techniques, different ways to move money from developing countries to these offshore accounts to countries like places like Ireland, and that is the major chunk.
So are you saying here that it's predominantly a white-collar crime in which it's the corporations and rich individuals involved as opposed to the drug cartels and child traffickers?
Of course, there should be no doubt about it.
Okay, so you mentioned here trade, and one of the most sophisticated forms of money laundering is trade-based money laundering. What can you tell us about that?
So a lot of studies have been done. People have written books on this subject. I'll just mention a couple of facts. A couple of years back, a French economist, Gabriel Zucman, he wrote a book titled "The Hidden Wealth of Nations." Now, he estimated that more than $7 trillion is parked in these offshore accounts, and that comes to around 10% of the global financial household wealth. Now, that's a major chunk. Now, when we talk about the flight of capital, another institute, another organization, Global Financial Integrity, it did a research a couple of years back, and it came out with a number. It estimated that every year between 620 and 970 billion dollars escapes developing countries, and most of this money goes out through these majors, through either under-invoicing or over-invoicing of the trade deals.
Okay, Saad, hold on to that thought. We also have Barrister Muhammad Ali Saif joining us, legal expert and a member of the Senate of Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us, Barrister. Barrister, so money laundering includes 3 steps majorly: placement, layering, and integration. If you could take us through those steps.
Yeah, well, these steps are basically, defined as those stages which the black money that you want to launder has to pass through, and you have to move it from the black cycle, which is undocumented, unaccounted for, and then take it through a transition process where it is either entered into some kind of legitimate business. Like, for example, you're running a pizza shop, you start showing the sales increasing, and basically it's not the actual sale of pizzas increasing, it's rather the black money getting into the process and into the circle in the economy. I'm giving this example of a pizza because there is a very famous case in the US about a decade ago, wherein the money was laundered by drug traffickers through sale of pizzas. And then once that is done, you can then declare that as your income, and later you can then reinvest it in either real estate or any other business which has a high yield. Mostly in the Western countries, money launderers used to and still are investing monies, they're laundered money in real estate or expensive cars or any other items, like even stamps or antique coins and stuff like that. And then, you know, as this the other gentleman speaking before me has just pointed out, that you either do under invoicing or over invoicing, but you basically put the money into the legitimate or the legalized cycle, and then through that you churn out, make it legitimate, clear it, document it, and then bring it into the market. So the dirty money gets clean money, and this is what money laundering process is.
Okay, Barrister Saif, so following from that description that you gave us of the process, can you tell us which step makes the individual most vulnerable?
Well, I believe it's vulnerability depends. Like in the U.S., DEA, you know, the Drug Enforcement Administration is a body that deals with narcotics and drug trafficking. I mean, they came up with the solution that they could not get the actual culprits who were involved in drug trafficking. But what they did was they found an easy way or a convenient manner of identifying their properties or assets. Like they used to have expensive yachts or expensive cars or expensive properties, and then they would like retrieve the money that was produced or that was earned through drug trafficking, and then invested in real estate through that means. That they would then the FBI used to and the DEA used to launch inquiries in relation to the ownership of the property, and then asking them as to where the money has come from, and then they would then tally their legitimate sources of income and the amount of the property, and then if there was a difference, which there used to be always quite big magnitude of difference, then they would then ask them and take them to task. But then keep in mind that that would also entail civil liability rather than criminal liability. But this was one of the ways in which they did, and this is the process that we are also now trying to follow in Pakistan. This is the easiest way.
Definitely. Barrister Straff, following from what you've just talked about, I'd like to take my next question to Einar and ask him, so when we talk about investments in artwork and things that have a subjective value attached to them, how difficult does it become to detect money laundering?
It's a game of cat and mouse, and it's constantly changing. What you have is the authorities will come up with one idea, and the people avoiding the taxes are coming up with another. Now, let's differentiate between two different kinds of money laundering. One is, as is said, this understating or overstating sales, whether it's pizza or things overseas. That is really just to avoid paying taxes. That's the second part is when you have illegal monies that you've earned and you're trying to legitimize it. And I think that's generally what we're talking about when we're talking about international money laundering. But this isn't shady people and mafia dons and things like that we're talking about. This is Deutsche Bank, which has paid out $18 billion since 2008 in fines alone, and now embroiled in two massive additional problems. One with Danske Bank, where tens of billions of dollars were transferred, and another one involving. So what's significant about this particular bank is it's Donald Trump's bank, and there have been many suggestions that the way he got his money there, which is not a very conventional way for a developer. Remember, he stiffed U.S. banks for about $3.4 billion through his various bankruptcies. And he has a business which is absolutely perfect for money laundering, because if you give him money to build a tower, and then somebody buys it for cash and then takes out loans, that is a very quick and usual way to launder money. And it's no coincidence that a lot of the bankers, the people who bank at that bank, are Russian.
And Anar, I do want to talk further about how banks and financial system can collaborate with money launderers. But before that, I'd like to ask Saad here. So with the advent of the internet, of course, money laundering has evolved, and there's many subtle ways to go about it. Can you tell us about that? How the dark net, how cryptocurrency facilitates money laundering?
Okay, even before we get into that question, we need to see some sides of this entire story. Now, when we talk about money laundering, there is obviously high net worth individuals, companies, or corrupt individuals moving money. But money laundering is also, violation of sanctions, whether they are the sanctions of the United Nations, whether they are the sanctions of United States of America. So the gentleman talked about banks. Now, most of the banks which have been penalized in last few years, they have been penalized, or many of them have been penalized for violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. And that is something we really need to look into, because that adds a political dimension to it. As I said before, we talk about like how there is a dark net, a dark industry, some people using cryptocurrency and all that. But really, the major chunk of the problem is right before us, and it's political. So even if you look at Pakistan, we just last year we had a case of bank, and the only problem there was a violation of compliance. Not violation, but like failed to look into certain transactions which emanated or which had to do with Iran, and that has really become a problem for many countries and many financial institutions, because the United States of America basically has a very huge and large say on in how the global financial system works, because you see international transactions take place in US dollars, and every US dollar transaction has to go through the New York settlement system. So they have a very large say, and the major chunk of money laundering cases, if you look at them, which involve financial institutions, have to do with violations of the US sanctions on different countries.
Okay. Saad, what about cryptocurrency and the darknet, something that I do want to still pester you on? How has that made money laundering more accessible or easy?
Okay, we need to understand that this cryptocurrency phenomena, it's very recent. People still don't understand how they work. Even institutions like organizations like IMF and World Bank, they don't have a lot of idea how these currencies are working, how these internet-based currencies actually operate, and how the transactions take place, how the money is moving, where is money is going. But yes, there is a lot of concerns. We saw that just a couple of months ago, the IMF held a meeting in Singapore. It asked all the financial institutions to come, let's sit together, let's work on regulations, because going forward, they see more of these paperless transactions, more of these cryptocurrencies coming into the mainstream, and they need to come up with regulations. So yes, right now, it is very easy for anyone who wants to make an illegal payment, who wants to move around money, he can or she can easily do that via cryptocurrency.
Okay, and definitely anonymity is a key factor there when we come to cryptocurrency and how it allows money laundering. But Barrister Saif, something that Saad mentioned here was how you cannot take the political aspect out of money laundering. And with that, I do want to ask you, money laundering is many times referred to as a victimless crime, but is it in fact victimless?
Well, I don't think that it is a correct statement to say that money laundering is a victimless crime, because you see, even if you look at the very definition of money laundering, it's money that has been earned or acquired through illegal means, and in the course of committing that illegal act, somebody has to suffer. Then whether it is drug trafficking, whether it is arms trafficking, or whether it is any other, even corruption, stealing money from the government or from the state, somebody has to suffer in the end, and he or she is the victim. And then also, for money laundering offense to be proven in a court, if you intend to do that, then you have to show that there was a predicate offense committed as well. That predicate offense becomes an obligation to be proved and to be established in a certain country, and then you have to prove that through that offense the money was acquired and then it has been transferred from one jurisdiction to another. So theoretically speaking or practically looking at it, it's not a victimless offense. There is somebody who is suffering, either a state or institution or individuals.
So how does it exactly erode the social fabric here?
You see, this is an illegal act, and facilitating an illegal act basically means that if a system facilitates it, that means its governance system, and in particular its economy and its financial governance system is weak. That is why you find a loophole to take your illegally gotten wealth from that system into another system, or even circulate it within that economy. So it is in a way basically using or exploiting weaknesses in a system that the money launderers use to launder their black money and make it white. Another issue is that most of these people who are engaged in these issues, in these offenses, on these activities, are usually criminals. They acquire these money through criminal acts, through violation of law. So of course it has a very strong bearing and a strong impact on on social values and social system in a country, and also has political ramifications as well. That is why money laundering law became more effective when there were political connections made. Money was being stolen by government officials or high-ranking politicians, and it was then taken out of their countries and taken to Switzerland and England and other developed countries, or Cayman Islands or Seychelles and all that. And if you look at especially the case of Nigeria, where billions of dollars of wealth was stolen by the government ministers in mid-80s, and that was parked in banks in Western Europe, and also real estate was bought with that money. So basically you are destroying the social, the political and the economic structure of a society or the system of society, and using those loopholes you are taking the money out. So this is basically has very negative implications, and I believe that money laundering is is like a cancer of economy, of economic system.
And that's a very interesting point there, Barrister Saif. I want to ask Einar here, explore criminality through an economic lens. How does money laundering transfer economic power from the market, from the government, to criminals?
Well, as you pointed out, there's my colleague pointed out there's 70 trillion estimated of wealth that is gone beyond any country. It's parked in all these places. I do disagree that this is just political in nature. The Panama Papers, which were released, showed that there was a wide-ranging group of elites in every country around the world who was involved in doing exactly this kind of thing, anonymizing money so that for their own purposes. So yes, I agree, it is not a victimless crime. This is something that eats away at the social fabric. It takes money away from legitimate government purposes, and it keeps it in the pockets of those who are generally very wealthy. Now, the reason I mentioned the banks initially was because these are the main perpetrators. The irony is that in London and New York, those are the two largest centers where money is being laundered almost on a daily basis. So it's kind of ironic that you have both Britain and the US always putting pressure on countries, saying that you shouldn't be laundering money, when in fact they're involved.
So do you think the black economy is so large that if banks do not engage with it, their shareholders will suffer, and in fact now it's become this thing that they have to do?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to cry any tears for banks who engage in illegal activities. That's like saying that I feel sorry for a pimp or a drug dealer. The fact is they are involved in criminal conspiracy. They should be sent off to jail. The real tragedy is that very few of them are actually treated the way their clients would be treated, the ones that they're helping launder this money, the drug dealers, the people who engage in this, modern white slavery, all this type of stuff. So that's the real tragedy. Now, there is a solution on the horizon, and that is electronic funds. And what I mean by that is traceable, trackable cryptocurrency. And that's very important because in the future, it'll be very, very difficult to transfer money around. You can do it with diamonds, you can do it with gold, you can do it with art pieces. There will be other ways, but actually using funds themselves will become very, very difficult. And if you want to engage in illegal transactions, you're going to have some way of transferring these things so you have actual control. Money will not be part of the solution.
Okay. And also on that point, how does money laundering give unfair competitive advantages to companies and multinationals? If you could explain that to us.
Well, quite frankly, once they've started down this road where they're laundering money, they're quite happy to pay bribes in order to make more. Since you have money that you don't have to track or talk about, it becomes very easy to transfer that into to government officials or whoever you need in order to get another business deal. And this is the essence of it. You create this huge underground economy, which becomes endemic to society, and you're in essence undermining a legitimate. Why should I obey the rules if I know that everybody above me is not?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point there. And Saad, something that you mentioned earlier, and of course, whenever we talk about money laundering, is offshore companies. And on that similar point, I want to move towards the debate of tax havens and how they operate. And of course, money coming into their economy helps their financial institutions. Do they have enough incentives to try to work towards international cooperation in countering money laundering?
Yeah, here it's the example of Ireland should be very interesting here. So Ireland is a small economy, but if you look at their numbers, they seem so blotted, and the reason is because they have given all these incentives to big corporations and multinationals to come and open up their head offices in the country. So companies like Apple, companies like Alphabet, many of the tech multinationals, they have moved their let's say for the tax purposes, they have moved their operations, their head offices to Ireland. Now, what does it mean? So last year, another study came out, and it found that these companies, Apple, Alphabet, Coke, and other multinationals, which are supposed to be based in the United States, they were hoarding more than $2 trillion outside of the United States. Now, how do they manage that money? How do they, keep all of that off the radar? Now, that's a big question, and now there is debate taking place on that. Now, the questions are being asked. Now, one thing which people normally don't talk about a lot, and I'll go back to the Paradise paper. Now, there's a company called Glencore. It's a commodities company. It's a major commodity trader. Now, that company has been involved in something called transfer pricing. So you see these multinational companies, when they have operations in developing countries, even in Pakistan, what they do is they through different ways, they move money from their operations in a country like Pakistan or in Nigeria or in Congo. They move there that money to their head offices, and they say we are making intra-company transactions. And on basis of that, they declare very low profits in these developing countries, and they hardly pay any taxes. And that has become a major issue.
Okay, so Saad, we're going to have to take a short break and then continue this conversation. Stay with us while we go for a short break. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we talk about money laundering, joining us now is Kaiser Bengali, who's an economist. Thank you so much for joining us. Kaiser, so we were talking about money laundering and how it impacts the economy, but I would like your take on it too. How does it exactly damage the economy?
I think there are two forms of money laundering broadly. One is business people are always transferring money from one account to another, which can be across countries also, because they are making investments. And if they are making investments, portfolio investments, then they can be transferring money on a daily basis from one country to another. But I think when we are talking of money laundering, we are basically talking about illegal money being parked in some account.
Yeah.
Now, that of course is, first of all, even if that illegally earned money is parked within the country, it is damaging because that money is no longer sort of used for legitimate purposes for which it can help the economy grow forward. But if that money is parked outside, then it's a net drain on the economy from which money is being diverted.
Okay, so
and if there is no cost, there is no cost to them in any way, no penalties, then of course this will happen this has been happening on a fairly large scale.
Yeah. So, Mr. Kaiser, before you joined our discussion here, we were talking about the roles that financial institutions play, banks play in terms of money laundering. And I want to ask your opinion on this. What role do banks play in international trade in order to identify and intercept financial crime?
Yeah, I think this cannot be done by one country alone.
Yeah.
Most laundered money is not transferred through formal banking channels. So that is done, informal channels, private channels.
But there are many case studies pointing towards how the banking system worked and operated in this regard.
Previously, of course, you could just put your money in the bank and ask. Earlier, before the 1990s, you couldn't transfer any money through banks. You had to get the permission of the state bank. After that, once the financial liberalization took place, you could transfer money. You could open dollar accounts here and transfer money. But since 9/11, of course, a lot of controls have been placed. If you're transferring money, there is an inquiry. You have to explain a lot of things about the money. So that has become difficult.
And since you mentioned 9/11 here, can you also expand upon how laundered money is used for financing terror?
But certainly, if I rob a bank, if I'm a terrorist and I rob a bank, and in country A, and of course, but I want to use that money to buy arms from country B and use those arms in country C. That is how it is done.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, it is not, partly it was done through banking channels, but mostly it was not done through banking channels.
Okay.
Now, of course, banking channels have become far more difficult, but non-banking channels are available.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Kaiser Bengali, for joining us and shedding light on those aspects there. Barrister Saif, something that Mr. Bengali mentioned here was how international cooperation is needed. And if I'd like your opinion on it, what needs to be done in the international community to counter this threat to the global economy, and what exactly is happening right now?
Yes, I agree with him in the sense that money laundering is an activity that is generated by either money earned from drug trafficking or arms trafficking or terrorism or corruption, and then you transfer it from one jurisdiction to another in order to launder it. But international cooperation is very much required because there are several countries involved, sometimes two countries, sometimes more than two countries, and that is why if you look at the convention, the United Nations Convention on Drug Trafficking, it does have provisions relating to transfer of funds and obliges a member state to keep an eye on on such transfers, and if they are related to drug money, then to take action and coercive action and prevent that. Number two, even the terrorism offenses, even there is another a convention dealing with trans-border terrorism. Yes, of course, that also has provisions relating to this. Third convention, which is very important, is UNCAC, which is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. It also has provisions dealing with money for which there is no legitimate explanation or is not from legitimate sources of income. There is another provision in most of these conventions, which is called the Mutual Legal Assistance Agreements, MLATs, treaties, which actually obliges all the member states to cooperate with each other in exchange of information, and also to take legal action if money can be identified stolen from one country and then parked in another country. So all these countries can help one another and cooperate with the judicial processes, also legal law enforcement processes, in order to get their get hold of that money. So therefore, without international cooperation, it is almost impossible to curb this menace, because it's a joint criminal enterprise. It's not done by one person or one company. It's by a joint company, operate by a conspiracy, by a gang of people acting in different jurisdictions. So yes, international cooperation is a must, and that is why most of these new developments in international law, recent developments, they all aim at forging these relationships in order to address this problem.
Yeah, and Barrister Saif, something that of course is related to this is also offshore accounts and their legality. If you could just tell us about that, dispel some myths associated to it, and just give us a more clear picture of what needs to be done with those and what can be done in that regard.
Well, yes, all these offshore havens, they were created basically to facilitate people who wanted to avoid taxes on their income. Cayman Island is there. There are many other. Panama was one place where you could open an account and then carry on business, and there were lots of tax exemptions and tax incentives. But they were also these places also became havens for those people who were involved in money laundering, and they were parking their money there. And using the banks registered in those jurisdictions as instruments or as conduits to launder their black money.
Yeah.
So this was one of the issues, but in order to handle that, the jurisdiction in which money laundering, from which money is taken out, it is mostly incumbent upon that jurisdiction or the responsibility of that jurisdiction to have laws that prevent illegal transfer of money. So if you could do that, then of course you can prevent that. But also, insofar as such jurisdictions are concerned where money offshore havens are available for launderers, like for example, I would say keeping even if we don't discuss those, even banks in Switzerland, banks in some other Western European countries, they were inviting actually black money by facilitating people to open accounts, numbered accounts, where they would keep their identities confidential, secret, and therefore it was like the whole mechanism was facilitating these people. But now, after 9/11, the situation has changed, and now it's becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah, Barrister Saif, I'd also like Saad to elaborate upon that, the policies in terms of these accounts, how they're numbered. If you could tell us more about that as well.
So you see, since the leak of Paradise Papers and Panama Papers, a lot of action has been taking place. The governments in Europe and other places, other continents, they have really realized that this is a big problem. But at the same time, if you look at just the recent history, in past 15 years, so many big banks have been penalized, but still these cases keep on coming up. They are penalized for hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet we see that every few months another financial institute is accused of laundering money, either for drug cartels, either for countries under sanctions, entities under sanctions. So the question is, why does it happen? It happens because of the financial incentive, because the returns are so high for either the executives of those financial institutions or the banks themselves, that they are willing to take the risk. They are willing to. They say, okay, fine, we'll pay the penalty and move on. So I'm not sure that if regulations will actually help end this practice entirely.
And Saad, with that, I also want to ask Einar here. So he thinks, Saad is of the opinion that regulations will not be that effective. But I want to ask you, are transparency laws, if they become more robust, could this counter the issue here?
Well, right now you have to kind of differentiate a couple of things here. One, you have illegal activities like drug dealing and financing of terrorism. That's illegal, and we can all agree on that. Yeah. Second, we have tax policy, and I think my colleague Saif was referring to that when he was talking about Alphabet and Apple parking money overseas. They can do that legally. And then the last part is this issue about sanctions. And what that means. That is something where one nation is basically, or a group of nations, is making something illegal to deal with another country. So let's talk about it in the conventional sense, which is this operation of terrorism, the kind of money that's coming from and to criminal activities, whatever they may be. Yes, the countries getting together can attack that together. That's all the things that are said about having the banks exchange information, having the countries exchange information, exchanging tax returns, collecting all the information. Now remember, with the advent of 5G, the AI, a lot of this stuff will be on computers, and they will be able to quickly go through and red flag any kinds of transactions. Now, as I was saying earlier, if you have an electronic currency, and for instance, China will be introducing one, the People's Bank of China will be introducing one before the end of this year, you can then track all that money. It becomes very, very, very difficult. And one of your other guests said that there are other means, physical means of moving money. That's very difficult. You have airports, you have private planes, trucks, things like that. You have to smuggle it.
Sorry to interrupt here, but when you're talking about these cryptocurrencies, can you tell us more about that? Because you know, Bitcoin and all these other cryptocurrencies were primarily banned because of the anonymity attached to them. But you're saying here that they could, in a way, counter money laundering?
When they're not anonymous, when the government knows that you have received this money and that you've transferred it, and they can trace that money to its ultimate destination. And in terms of paying taxes, taxes will be paid at the transaction point. So instead of waiting and hoping that somebody will pay their taxes, it'll be collected. And if there's going to be a return, somebody will have to offer proof that this money, that they actually are owed something back, and that it can be actually calibrated to their financial activities. So this will have the largest change, especially for governments when they're collecting revenues and tracing any money that is going towards, as I said, criminal activity. The other point, though, is that the reason these banks are all involved is, as he said, there's an incentive there. And it's not just that. The banks themselves are involved in criminal activities. For instance, fixing LIBOR. You know, this was a huge, huge deal. This was a benchmark the world set its lending on, and it turned out these banks were getting together and doing it. There seems to be a malaise among our professional class, and it's not just the banks, it's also the lawyers, the insurance companies, the advisors, accounting groups. They seem to be all in this together, and when they are caught, nothing happens.
Yeah. And Barrister Saif, Einar is talking about here how there is so much incentive involved for banks to become corrupt, and they are not punished enough. What are the policies that need to be implemented here? What needs to be done in order to rein them in?
Well, you have to regulate banking laws and make them more robust and more stricter. Number one, financial transactions should be electronically monitored, and anything that is suspicious action must be taken immediately. Like for example, a few years ago, banks started implementing this regulation. At least in Pakistan, the State Bank mandated them to have this KYC, know your customer regulations. Previously, it was very easy to open an account and start making transactions, but now it's quite difficult, and transactions above a certain amount are always monitored, and the bank bank actually inquires into the nature of transaction, or if funds are transferred into your account. So the regulatory bank, whichever it is, whether it's the State Bank of Pakistan or whether it is the Bank of England or whichever it is, the regulator must keep monitoring the activities of the banking sector, because there are many banks, especially in Africa and in some other countries. I have some experience of such banks which are openly involved in transacting black money from one jurisdiction to another. They were like facilitating, and the whole business of those banks actually was dependent upon such transactions. So these are there are ways of doing it, but again I would just stress upon this particular point that banking, I mean, if I'm a money launderer and if I want to launder my money, the last place I would visit would be a bank. I would rather avoid those banks. There are many other channels available. I can transfer money through hundi and hawala even now, although they have been made illegal, but still there are ways and means to transfer. Then, as my colleague just pointed out, that it is difficult to physically move money. Yes, you don't have to move paper money, but you can move it in forms of diamonds or something else. Items that are small in size but highly expensive, and people are doing it from one jurisdiction to another. So therefore, I mean, I think that the first point to start with is definitely the banking sector and other financial institutions. But having said that, that does not mean that all the venues that are used for money laundering are covered or are addressed. There still are other informal and illegal channels or channels that cannot be monitored very easily by the state authorities, which can still be used.
Yeah. And Saad, last one to you. Do you also have shared a similar view with Barrister Saif here? And what do you think needs to be done now in order to counter money laundering?
You know, I'll refer to what Mr. Einar just mentioned about the rollout of 5G. About cryptocurrencies. So you see, IMF has been pushing this idea that a kind of cryptocurrency should be introduced, which the central banks of individual countries should monitor or have control over. Now that's a very interesting concept, and that might work. And so, you know, we would have to see. We would have really, as Mr. Einar mentioned, technology is going to be key here. If going forward we see these electronic transactions, more and more electronic transactions taking place, and authorities have these powerful computers and algorithms to, you know, in real time keep track of all the transactions, then yes, it is going to become very difficult for drug traffickers, for corrupt politicians, for corrupt businessmen to launder money.
Yeah. And Einar, on that point, what do you think might be the hindrances preventing this cryptocurrency from being adopted? What resistance, what pushback can be expected?
Well, quite frankly, it's just new, and the issue is that people have to get used to it. There's been so much talk, and everyone, as you mentioned, everyone associates crypto with, you know, these kind of anonymous cryptocurrencies, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about, instead of issuing paper, they have a notation. Right now, there are $48 trillion a year. Last year was exchanged via the internet. 3 trillion of that was consumers. 45 trillion was business to business. So this is going to continue to increase. It just makes too much sense. It also cuts out a lot of the middlemen. And so from an economic point of view, it will be the future. And I think the central banks love the idea of having a much better way to track currency that does not involve physical notes which wear out.
Yeah. Okay. And Barrister Saif, last question to you before we end the show. What role can civil society play in this, if any role at all?
Well, I believe it's awareness and advocacy, the society, and forcing the government, right, campaigning to force the government to enact laws and legislation to make it difficult for people having black money to launder it, number one. Number two is any system, in my opinion, where there is weak governance, it is bound to have corruption, because corruption is basically the byproduct or manifestation of bad governance. So if you address your governance mechanisms, probably the quantum of corruption will reduce. And if that is reduced, then naturally there will be less black money. But it is easy said than done. However, civil society can lobby the governments for effective legislation, and also monitoring all those activities which are illegal and report them to the state authorities.
Thank you so much, Barrister Mohammad Ali Saif, for joining us. We're running short on time. Thank you so much, Einar Tangen, for joining us, Saad Hassan for joining us, giving us some insight onto this debate. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.